The announcement that Death Note was releasing a one-shot comic to continue the story of Ryuk and his Death Note came as a surprise to many fans. Death Note is a much beloved thriller, and to some is considered to be as close to perfect an anime or manga could get. So, what else could this manga have left to tell its readers? Was the original Death Note not complete? To answer the latter, yes, Death Note was a complete story. Death Note was an allegory that told the story of Christ's death, resurrection, and the destruction of the Antichrist through the life of Light Yagami, who gained miraculous mortal power through the Death Note and the Shinigami Ryuk. It is hard to make a story more absolute than to defeat the Antichrist himself, but to answer the former question, what the Death Note one-shot explains to the world is somewhat of a sermon that applies application to principle. It shows us the implication of the original Death Note parable in our contemporary lives. The story of the Death Note one-shot follows that of Tanaka Minoru. He was given the Death Note by Ryuk the Shinigami, having grown both bored and hungry for apples since the death of Light Yagami. Minoru is a below average student with a gifted intellect, an intellect that contrasts that of Light Yagami, as Minoru's genius lies in his ability to solve problems and plan for his own interests, rather than a general cunning that would make him seem perfect in all things to the outside world. Only a middle school student, Minoru had heard the legend of Kira, and once offered the Death Note, devises a plan, asking Ryuk to return to him with the Death Note in 2 years' time. When Ryuk returns in 2019, the plan is simple. In exchange for an apple a day, Minoru gets Ryuk to spread a message through local television that he has the power Kira had, and that he wishes to sell the Death Note to the highest bidder. Ryuk does all the footwork, flying to a local news station and holding up a sheet of paper with messages during live broadcasts. This inevitably attracts the attention of the former Japanese Kira task force, and Nier. Nier watches Minoru's moves, or as Nier comes to call him, A Kira. Unfortunately for Nier, Minoru's plan is perfect. He cannot be traced because he chooses not to use the Death Note and doesn't move, making Ryuk deliver all the messages. As the contest continues, the United States eventually outbids every other country in bidder to get the Kira power. They pay and the transfer happens. Money is sent to all accounts for persons under 60 at a specific bank in Japan, meaning Minoru and thousands of others receive a huge cash prize. Nier gives up on finding A Kira, knowing that the Death Note will invariably be in the hands of the President of the United States. But one final twist leads to Minoru's demise. The Shinigami King adds one more rule to the Death Note, that if the Death Note is sold or bought, both the seller and buyer, the moment the transaction occurs, will die. So what does this story mean? This particular reading of the Death Note one-shot is based on its broader symbolic meaning rather than what the plot or tone of the story is doing or how Akira compares to Light Yagami. That said, what is the text saying? Firstly, let's talk about what we see within the text. Ryuk says something interesting at the end of the chapter. Ryuk meets with the President of the United States, who is drawn to be President Trump. So I'll call him Trump here because I think that choice was very deliberate, for reasons I'll explain shortly. Trump said that he won't take the book because of the warning that Ryuk gives him that if he accepts, he will die. But as Ryuk leaves, flying through the city, he reflects. Having promised Minoru that he wouldn't speak to him again, Ryuk had already allowed him to die, signing his name into the Death Note. Ryuk ponders, saying this:
I guess it doesn't matter how you do it. Any human who uses the Death Note meets an unfortunate end.
So far, all of the humans that have used the Death Note have died tragically and prematurely before Ryuk ever met Minoru. And Minoru was no exception. The King of Death will not be mocked. The fate of those who use the Death Note is clear: death. This evokes the imagery of the Bible in Romans 6:23 when it says, "The wages of sin is death." But as Ryuk describes it, Minoru's plan was perfect. So in order to justify this law, the King of Death makes it so Minoru's perfect plan will result in the same for him as it did for Light and everyone else who used the Death Note in the past. Minoru didn't write in the book once. He merely used Ryuk's powers to sell it, but in doing so, signed his own death warrant. But what does this mean for Trump? Without taking the book itself, Trump says that he will tell everyone that he has it, but will then refuse to use it. Ryuk, in the last 2 pages of the chapter, predicts Trump's demise.
I guess it doesn't matter how you do it. Any human who uses the Death Note meets an unfortunate end.
If Trump truly seeks to pretend to have the Death Note, using it as a silent trump card, no pun intended, of unparalleled power to strike fear and respect in his enemies and love in his admirers, Ryuk tells us that he too will meet an unfortunate end. For the Death Note is the symbolic representation of satanic power. Using the power of a literal devil to fool the world is just what Light did, and Minoru after. Ryuk allows this for his own entertainment because he is entertained by sin, by the suffering of humans and seeing their pride, greed, and their envy destroy themselves and the world around them. He even asks for sin as payment for his services, apples being the most well-known metaphor for sin throughout literature. Ryuk may seem innocent enough, childlike even, giving humans a gift of power and letting them do as they will. But Ryuk is certainly evil. He has not love nor respect for humans or life. He lies when it suits him. He helps when it suits him. He kills when it suits him. All in an effort to create loss and death, the sin that keeps him so well entertained. This is why the only way for a Shinigami to die is for them to extend a human's life, the literal opposite of what they were designed for. And so, from this very devil, he reminds the audience of the dangers of using his powers. Now, for an outside reading of the text. It is clear to me that Death Note's writer, Tsugumi Oba, decided to collaborate with Takeshi Obata years later for this final chapter for a reason. Given our current times, the reputation that Trump has overseas, my belief is that Oba wanted to send 2 messages to the fans of the series. I think Oba wanted to remind them that in his story there is no right way to use the Death Note. The Death Note is evil itself. Anyone who uses its power will die, no matter if they use it directly or indirectly. He probably noticed that his fan base was appropriately curious of ways to use the Death Note for their own ends, but lost sight of the lesson. The Death Note is evil, and only death will come of it. The very promise that Ryuk makes to Light in the beginning of their arrangement is true, that he will be the one to write his name in the Death Note when all is said and done. And this is probably the most sincere and honest thing that Ryuk says to Light, because you can trust that everything else that Ryuk says is in service of his entertainment. The second thing is more obvious. It's a warning to Donald Trump. I don't think that Oba's choice to use President Trump's face rather than that of Obama or a generic presidential figure was on accident. Nor do I think that the time skip placing the events of the story in 2019 was an accident either. I cannot be sure of Oba's political opinions or sensibilities, but I believe that Oba wanted to be clear that what President Trump is doing in his actual presidency in the most powerful country on earth is akin to the fear and evil that the Death Note creates. He warns Trump that he too will meet an unfortunate end. And there is where he ends his sermon. I don't expect that there will be much else out of Death Note from Oba and Obata, at least as it concerns the story and world of Ryuk and his Death Note. It seems like the book is finally closed. Death Note, the original series, was a parable of the Savior and the Antichrist, and was wrapped up in a bow by this chapter, nailing in the message or principle: there is no safe way to use the Death Note.